a story you may have been very intensely about a while back and maybe since forgotten. But Brendan Dassey, who you may remember as Stephen Avery's cousin in Netflix's Making a Murderer documentary, he won a major court victory as a federal appeals court upheld an earlier federal judge overturning his conviction of sexually assaulting and killing Teresa Halbach. You may remember, if you've seen that footage in the documentary, in which he was being questioned at age 16 with no parents or no lawyer present. It also suggested that Mr. Dassey was improperly questioned and that he was mentally unfit. Federal Judge William E. Duffin found that Mr. Dassey was coerced into a confession in which he admitted that he assisted his uncle, Stephen Avery, in sexually assaulting and killing the photographer, Teresa Halbach. Dassey later recanted the confession last August. So in a 2-to-1 decision, a panel of the United States Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit said that it agreed with the ruling. And for now, Dassey, he's now age 27. He will remain in jail. The Wisconsin Department of Justice has indicated they want to appeal the panel's decision.
So this is the second big victory for Brendan Dassey, getting a federal judge to vacate a murder conviction is a rare event. Now, 3 out of 4 judges who have ruled on this case, this 2-to-1 decision by the panel of the 7th District Court of Appeals and by the first federal judge, Judge Duffin. That's 3 judges out of 4 who want to vacate this conviction. Brendan Dassey should never have been in prison. It's a giant, colossal, huge miscarriage of justice that Brendan Dassey is, and everyone who saw that show and saw that confession knows it. Knows that the cooperation between his counsel and the investigator for the cops was outrageous on that alone. Forget ineffective counsel. That's it, and they blew it. And they had no reason to go after Brendan Dassey and include him in a prosecution of Steve Avery. I feel like they did it because it made their case against Avery make more sense, and they ended up willingly putting perhaps a 16-year-old kid in prison for the rest of his life. You don't get 3 federal judges be willing to vacate a murder conviction unless you have totally blown that case. They've totally blown the case. If there's an ounce of courage there at the Wisconsin Department of Justice, they don't appeal it to the full 7th Circuit and they don't take it to the Supreme Court. Hopefully the 7th Circuit will let that 2-1 decision stand and the Supreme Court won't take the case of Brendan Dassey out of prison. That is not a comment in any way on whether Steve Avery did it, but Brendan Dassey needs to be free. If this is in the United States of America, Brendan Dassey has no business in prison.
Well, the Making a Murderer documentary was full of what you saw, and what Ben is sort of alluding to here is a lot of ego on the part of prosecutors and law enforcement. And I suspect that maybe some of that ego has been beaten out of them through the legal process thus far. But I tend to agree with the Brendan Dassey part of this equation, and as Ben also sort of alluded to, there's another part of this, and that's Stephen Avery. And the Making a Murderer was a documentary that was pretty damning toward the prosecution of Stephen Avery. But if you actually look at the facts, I did a whole episode of my podcast, which you can download at edge-show.com.
Nice plug.
It's called The Edge with Mark Thompson. But we did a whole episode about just this, the refutation of Making a Murderer, with a reporter there in Wisconsin who was following this case. And so you began to see the inconsistencies in the way the documentary presented the facts. But again, allowing for that, allowing for the Stephen Avery part of this, the fact that he likely did murder that photographer, it would appear that Brendan Dassey has served time that he never should have served.
Yeah, they don't have it on Brendan Dassey. They don't have it, and then they accidentally got a confession out of him that was coerced in the worst possible ways, and the betrayal by his defense attorney, the incompetent, foolish guy who had, to me, personally thought no business being a lawyer, was egregious. So again, you have 3 federal judges vacating a murder conviction. They don't do that. They do not do that. They got to let him go. They don't have a case without the confession. So if the confession's thrown out, Brendan Dassey is going to walk.
Last point, Kim, I just was going to mention it for those who haven't seen.
I haven't finished it, which is why I'm not saying that much on this
What Ben's
topic.
talking about when he talks about coercing the confession is they had Dassey there, this 16-year-old kid, and they have him hour after hour after hour after hour. I mean, they literally no food, nothing. And
he retained a counsel. They didn't have, his lawyer wasn't there. His lawyer knew he was there and didn't come. I mean, and his lawyer cooperated with the prosecution's investigator. They're battling each other, and it wasn't cooperating like, hey, let's make a deal. It was cooperating, and again, if you watch it, Brandon Dassey's got no business in prison. The case against Stephen Avery is much stronger, and I will say that I heard a podcast, obviously not as good as The Edge, but on Alec Baldwin's podcast, which they're both excellent. But Baldwin had the Making the Murderer producers on, and they were much more clear in their arguments that there was a grave miscarriage of justice against Brandon Dassey. They are unclear why they thought it was a good documentary, and that even if Stephen Avery did it, and obviously we're never gonna know unless they arrest someone else, right, or who is somehow connected to this case, or unless some cops admit that they framed Stephen Avery. But since we don't have another murderer, that the case against Avery is less clear. They feel like the case against Dassey is clear, right, that this guy had no business being in prison.
I actually heard that same episode, and I felt what Ben is saying as it pertains to what we're talking about is that the filmmakers really feel that Brandon Dassey is an innocent man. They waffled on Stephen Avery, and more to the point, I feel they've been given a pass on that, and I think Baldwin gave him a pass on that episode. I heard it, and what happened, and just again, then we'll move on, is that Making a Murderer was such a sensation, notwithstanding the fact that Kim didn't see all of it. It was such a sensation that these filmmakers were celebrated, and they started doing the talk show circuit and television and radio. They did Alec Baldwin's podcast, etc. And I think at that point it was tough to walk anything back, right? You know, so maybe some justice served in Brandon Dassey's the decision regarding Brandon Dassey today.
Incompetent, whether Stephen Avery did it or not, the police work was, there were many moments of incompetent investigation and egos taking over. That's certainly true, which is what made the documentary partly compelling, is that you see, and it was a great insight for Americans, I think, to be able to see that whole process. Great drama in that case.
You don't like ads? I hear you, brother. You know how you can avoid ads for the Young Turks? Become a Young Turks member and get all the content ad-free. TYTnetwork.com/join.